Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Under the Macroscope, our weekly Skybound Capital podcast. And great to welcome back our Chief Investment Officer, Theodore Xu, who is still in Shanghai. But by the time we speak on a future podcast in the next week or so, he will be back in Skybound Capital's Hong Kong office. Theo, great to have you back. I want to start with something that was in the news, even here where I'm sitting in South Africa in the past week, around growth forecasts for China, and those being revised downwards, and mainly, or perhaps exclusively, off the back of rising COVID cases in China. Is this something to be taking seriously, or is it not really worth that much attention?
Thank you, Matt. I'm very happy to be back on the show too. I think it's always worth taking all the economic forecasts seriously, no matter whether they're from domestic people or, in this particular case, IMF. I'm sure IMF gets a lot of useful data points and supporting materials or information that help them to arrive at that conclusion. And I think you're right. Some of the key factors that are influencing these revision downwards are possibly directly related to COVID cases. I think in some of our previous podcasts, we talked about how normal a life we are living in China, or I am living in China, which, by the way, is still the case, but we are seeing more and more outbreaks of new COVID cases, new domestic COVID cases in several cities in China. China is trying to contain those very well, but we are seeing large cities with millions of population being locked down in the same way as we are seeing in Australia, in other parts of the world too. COVID is one thing, but on the other hand, during summer, as we previously discussed, there have been natural disasters impacting not only China, but many other countries too. A lot of resources were put into handling the aftermath of those natural disasters, which some of which might be positive for the economy, and some of which are still dragging the future growth. So I think given all these different aspects of our economy today, it's probably conservative to project that Chinese economy is going to grow at a slightly slower pace. With that said, we are growing on a very low base of 2020. So for the whole year, Chinese economy was still expected to grow over 8%, which is great. And by the way, China is far above the previous high of its GDP anyway. So we are growing to new highs. With that said, I think there are definitely still many concerns from home and abroad around where China will see its future growth, or what are the future growth engines of China. And we definitely will keep a very close eye when we're on the ground here.
Yeah. And it does lead seamlessly into our next topic around regulation. So we have seen another story emerging where we are sitting here, which is obviously of great interest to us, around NASPERS and more specifically the effect on NASPERS of Tencent, and some negativity being expressed around Tencent due to regulatory issues coming out of Hong Kong. And perhaps you could shed some light on that for us, because speaking to you earlier, it's not just about this one particular company. There's something broader at play here.
Yeah, I think this really is very relevant to our previous discussion on the GDP growth or economic growth. And I agree, this has been occupying all the news headlines everywhere too, about all these different regulations coming out of China in the most recent past, having impact on various sectors. And I guess it was very eye-catching because it influenced some of the largest companies in capital markets, and where shareholders might be losing a lot of money. But the fact is, for any country, you possibly are seeing new regulation coming out every day or every month at least. And back to the case of China, we don't necessarily see an acceleration of coming up with new regulations per se. But as I said, it is very eye-catching because now some of these regulations are impacting the large companies. And the process of launching new regulations in China is also very similar to the process elsewhere, where you normally will come out with a draft, and then you consult public opinions, you receive public feedback, and then you revise your draft until you finally issue your final version of the regulation. Therefore, although it might be true that we are seeing quite a lot of new regulations coming out, they didn't come out overnight. Many of them were well drafted and well known in the market already. So take those regulations specifically related to Tencent, for example. Last year, we saw a lot of those related to fintech, or regulating fintech companies, regulating peer-to-peer lenders. And that really was for the financial stability in the system. Of course, that also directly led to the suspension of a prominent IPO, and some of these other competitors, similar businesses, including Tencent's fintech business, were also impacted. So that was one example. But this year we are seeing more around antitrust, around consumer protection. And by the way, those two are actually interrelated in the sense that many of these new regulations are trying to protect consumers from being manipulated or being screwed by the large companies. So that's one aspect of this. But this week specifically, I also want to talk about regulation, or I should say the difference between regulations and rumors, or between regulations and media comments, which is directly related to Tencent. So a few days ago, there was a news article coming out of a state media in China, bashing the entire online game industry, accusing that as the modern day of opium, or psychological opium, which directly leads to a 10% tanking of Tencent share price within hours. But as I said, you need to differentiate between real government regulation and a news article. Although it is coming out of state media, it doesn't mean it's representative of a new law coming out. In fact, that same article was withdrawn within hours too, meaning someone up there is not happy to see a news coverage like this.
But the damage had been done.
Exactly. Yeah. We have seen quite many counter arguments since then. And you're right, the damage was done to the extent that right in the middle of the day, in between the morning and afternoon trading sessions, the large game companies, including Tencent, came out with their new new measures that they plan to put in place in order to deal with some of the issues mentioned in the article, inclusive of measures that will further prevent young kids from playing long hours of games on their cell phones, etc.
Theo, you've mentioned the effect on large companies with some excellent examples, but what about the effect on private capital?
Yes, so whenever we see these regulations come out, we always try to ask the question whether that means a change of stance Like, are they still encouraging private capital or are they against private capital? Our conclusion so far is no, it's still very encouraging private capital. But obviously, there's a guidance on where the private capital is encouraged to be investing into. And this directly has implications on our investment process. Like, shall we be checking carefully on what regulations are being launched and whether we should be playing against such regulations or such trends or along with it so that we can locate new investment opportunities?
Well, this is one of the things I always love about chatting with you, because maybe we can use that to finish off this week's discussion. I mean, what is the intent, in your opinion, of the regulations, and wherein lie those investment opportunities in amongst it?
Sure. So I will summarize it in 3 points. Number one, having more kids. So that really is very different from many people's conventional opinion or impression of China when it still had this one-child policy. Now it has been escalated to a 3-child policy. So, and it's not to prevent people from having more kids. Rather, on the contrary, they are trying to encourage people to have more kids. So like a lot of the regulation, for example, we saw the shutdown of the entire tutoring sector in China a few weeks ago. That really is to encourage kids to have a better life, to have a more enjoyable life in a way, and to encourage parents to have kids who don't need to suffer through the whole process. So that's the number one drive. And trust me, we are going to see this becoming a secular theme of investing in China or China-related investment. It could be infant formula. It could be even childcare related services, etc. So keep an eye. With that said, though, in the long term, I'm sure it's almost not reversible that the population will go down in more advanced economies. So that's number one. Number two, really equality. China has a Gini factor, which measures like the wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots, have been worsening in recent years, although it's not to the extent of the worst cases that we see elsewhere. But given the governing body is a communist party, they are trying to encourage or promote equality in its population. And therefore, this ties back to my point on protecting consumers from the large companies exploiting them, right? So they want to make sure that you are not overpaying for a product or services simply because you are in an underprivileged status compared to the large internet giants, which does make sense. Of course, it will have impact on those large giant companies. I'm not saying they will no longer grow. They will still grow. They will still enjoy a good life too, but they will no longer be able to manipulate the market or the consumers simply because they are large enough. So that's the second main drive. And the last one is also probably the most surprising one, is carbon neutrality or environment protection. China has been talking about it for many, many years, but many outsiders never took it seriously or never thought it was a genuine expression of its intention. But it is true that China is targeting to reach its peak of carbon emission by 2030 and reach carbon neutral status around 2050 to 2060. And China is doing everything it can now. And we can see that having impact on listed companies already, like many companies that are either in the EV sector or encouraging renewable energy use, are getting rewards directly from investors' capital right now. And we believe now that we still have a few decades to go, again, that will be a secular theme to last for a long while. Investors should align their capital with those key drives that I just mentioned.
Yeah, as always, just fascinating hearing that view and getting more detail, more insight into the macro factors in your part of the world. And we wish you well with your move back from Shanghai to Hong Kong, from whence we shall catch up with you next time. As always, you can download the Under the Macroscope podcast on Apple, Spotify, or the Google podcast platform for Android. And all the past podcasts are available at Skybound Capital's website at www.skyboundcapital.com. Until next time on Under the Macroscope, thanks to Theo and have a great week.